When you talk about the greatest big men in basketball history, names like Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Shaquille O'Neal are usually considered on the Mount Rushmore. When you talk about the top 10, then you start to hear names like Moses Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, and one day we might add another two names to that list. The three-time NBA MVP Nikola Jokic and the young Victor Wembanyama, who has the potential to be the greatest of them all. But what if I was to tell you there was once a player considered a combination of those two guys? See, when we talk about the biggest what-ifs in NBA history, people ask, what if Derrick Rose never got injured? What if James Harden stayed in OKC? What if Shaq and Kobe never broke up? But the biggest what if is if a healthy Arvydas Sabonis played in the NBA, because if that happened, as you'll find out if you watch till the end of this video, the entire NBA today could have changed, because this guy had the potential to be the greatest of all time. A great case study in understanding how good Sabonis could have been is his son, Domantas Sabonis, who other than Nikola Jokic is probably the best passing big in the NBA. He got that passing gift from his father. Domantas is one of the best centers in today's NBA, and if he was 7'3" like his father, try and imagine how good he could have been. Arvydas Sabonis has been described as a combination of Jokic, his son, and Victor Wembanyama. According to legend, he was the original unicorn, and one of the first players to ever tell the tale of a young Arvydas Sabonis was NBA legend Bill Walton, who said, quote, "When I watched him play, he probably had a quadruple double at halftime, and his coach didn't even start him in the second half. He could do everything. He had the skills of Larry Bird and Pete Maravich. He had the athleticism of Kareem and could shoot the three-point shot, pass the ball, dribble. We should have kidnapped him in the early 80s and brought him back then." But Bill Walton, the Hall of Famer, wasn't the only player to sing Sabonis praises. Listen to how people talk about him so we understand the caliber of player we're discussing.
One of the best passing big men in history.
But he was like 7 foot tall, like 280, 290. He was built like a tree, right? And he had massive hands and the biggest head you'll ever see in your life. Like
just huge.
Yeah, it was like somebody.
Like a bobblehead. He was like a living bobblehead.
He was like somebody put a keg of beer on his shoulders. His head was so big.
I always said that if he would have played his prime in the NBA, I mean, we caught him at the tail end. You played against him in '99. What can you say about one of the most skilled big men that we've ever seen in the NBA?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree. I think we didn't see him in his prime, but what we saw was still something pretty special.
So the question is, why, if Arvydas Sabonis was this good, isn't he considered one of the greatest players ever? To understand, we need to know his story. Arvydas Sabonis was born in Lithuania, who at the time were a part of the Soviet Union, which made his basketball career very political. The Cold War was still ongoing, so a player from the Soviet Union coming to America was very complicated. At 17 years old, his first big test came against Team USA. He was matched up with Virginia's Ralph Sampson, who at the time was the 3-time National Player of the Year in college and considered the best college basketball player since Lou Alcindor. Sabonis was 5 years younger than Sampson and still outplayed him in this match, holding Sampson to 6 of 17 shooting while having 21 points, 14 rebounds, 3 assists and 4 blocks himself. While Team USA narrowly won this game after Sabonis fouled out in overtime, the Lithuanian prodigy would get his revenge, as that summer the Soviet Union defeated USA to win gold at the World Cup. Sabonis continued to dominate Europe, and by the age of 21 years old, Arvydas had already won 2 European Player of the Year awards and won another title with the Soviet national team at Eurobasket in 1985. That year he was drafted by the Atlanta Hawks, which he didn't even know about until a year later because the NBA blocked it because European players under 21 weren't allowed to be drafted. The Hawks were very unhappy that the following year Sabonis was drafted by another team, this time by the Portland Trail Blazers in the first round, and you can see how controversial this selection was at the time.
For the last pick of the first round, of the NBA draft, America's game, the Portland Trailblazers select Arvydas Sabonis of the Soviet Union.
Well, now that's going to be an interesting selection.
In the 1986 World Cup final, we got to see a young Sabonis up against David Robinson. Both players were the same age. Sabonis was considered the best in Europe, while David Robinson was National Player of the Year and, like Ralph Sampson, was considered one of the greatest college basketball players ever and went on to be the #1 pick the following year. And just look at what Sabonis did in this game. While Team USA won by single digits in the end, Arvydas Sabonis proved for a second time in his young career that he was at the same or similar level to two of the greatest big men of that generation. But by the time he was 21 years old, Sabonis was already a ticking time bomb, tearing his Achilles several times. There is a lot of speculation that this injury was an inside job. Lithuania, while a part of the Soviet Union, were looked down upon as a smaller nation. It's been speculated that because of Sabonis' success in the Soviet Basketball League, winning 3 consecutive titles with Zalgiris, ending the CSKA Moscow dynasty who had won it 9 times in a row prior to that powerful people did not like this. So when playing for the national team, Sabonis was overworked, and there's a conspiracy that the head coach of the national team was paid under the table to keep Sabonis out of the NBA by any means necessary. Arvydas Sabonis has been quoted saying that his injuries came as a result of him playing too much basketball without rest, and it's been suggested that coaches weaponized his competitive nature against him. They'd lure him into practices as a spectator, then they'd encourage him to get some shots up, then be a rebound guy, then to help out as a big body for defensive possessions, and eventually he was participating in full practices. Once word got back to the higher-ups in the Soviet Union that Sabonis was able to play, he was forced to compete in international tournaments against his will. So the first what if of this video begins with Sabonis' health. Remember, this was 1986. Medical science and doctors were not advanced like they are today, so we probably never got to see the best version of this player because of injuries that started in his early 20s. Nonetheless, the version we got to see of Arvydas Sabonis was still one of the best basketball players in the world. This isn't a story of somebody who had a bad injury and was never the same, because Arvydas Sabonis continued to be the best player outside of the NBA, and in 1988 Sabonis travelled to Portland to undergo Achilles surgery after tearing his same Achilles another 2 times. We know from NBA players today that surgery will rule you out for an entire season, but with the ongoing rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US at the time, the only thing that mattered was winning. So Sabonis was again forced to play on the world stage in the 1988 Olympics, and despite not being close to 100% healthy, he led the Soviet Union to gold, defeating USA in the semi-final, and then also Yugoslavia with FIBA GOATs Drazen Petrovic, Toni Kukoc. Still, Sabonis, post-Achilles, defeated 2 of the best international teams of his generation to win Olympic gold. Arvydas Sabonis continued to suffer injuries through the late 80s. By 1990 he had developed chronic knee alignments and suffered several recurring ankle and groin injuries. His body was breaking down on him at a very young age, but he continued to play through pain and still, when on the court, was usually the best player. By this point the Cold War was coming to an end, so going to the NBA was finally on the cards. Remember, back then there were no mobile phones, and in a moment that changed basketball history, Sabonis was actually unable to sign with the Blazers in 1989 because before word got back to him that representatives from the Blazers were actually on a plane with his NBA contract, he had just signed a deal with Spanish club Valladolid, who were able to fly over to Lithuania faster, denying Sabonis of his NBA dream and forcing him to play in Spain's Liga ACB. be. After 3 years at Valladolid, Sabonis was back on the Olympic stage, though this time representing his home country of Lithuania, who were significantly smaller than the Soviet Union. They had a population of just 3.7 million people, which is nothing compared to the 300 million population of the Soviet Union. Still, Sabonis led Lithuania to a bronze medal after falling to the Dream Team in the semi-final. That summer, Sabonis could have joined the NBA, in what would be the prime years of his basketball career. This time the decision was up to him, and he decided to stay, because after spending so much of his career in Europe, a big goal for Sabonis became winning the EuroLeague championship, the only international title he had never won. Domestically in Spain, he won multiple league titles, was regular season MVP and MVP of the finals multiple times, and in 1995, almost a decade after losing in the finals to Drazen Petrovic, Sabonis finally became a European champion, winning the EuroLeague championship with Real Madrid. He was Player of the Year again in Europe, MVP of the EuroLeague finals, and by this point Sabonis had established himself as probably the greatest European player of all time. It was only then, finally, at almost 31 years old, he came to the NBA. By the time Arvydas joined the NBA, it had been almost a decade since the Blazers drafted him, but by this point his body was almost completely broken. A doctor in Portland stated that he would have been eligible for a handicapped parking spot based on his X-ray alone. Sabonis even had doubts as to whether or not he'd be able to keep up with the pace of play in the NBA, but chose to go ahead with the move to Portland anyway because he knew he would regret it later in life if he never challenged himself in the best basketball league in the world. All the injuries he suffered and played through in his younger years had caught up to him. The athleticism he showcased in his younger years was gone. He could barely jump. He wore knee braces on both knees and spent his entire NBA career on a minutes restriction. His body didn't age well at all. Nonetheless, as a testament to how great he was, he adapted and was still able to be an effective NBA player. As the oldest rookie in NBA history, he made the All-Rookie First Team, finished second in Rookie of the Year voting, and was also the runner-up to the Sixth Man of the Year award after averaging 14.5 points and 8 rebounds his rookie year. The best year statistically of his NBA career was in 1997, aged 33. And while his career averages in the NBA aren't too impressive, during his first 5 NBA seasons, he averaged 14, 8 and 2. Now when looking at his assist numbers, you have to remember that back then, the idea of positionless basketball and your 7-footer facilitating the offense was almost unheard of, except from that one year where Wilt Chamberlain led the league in assists. So those assist numbers are very misleading. His career averages don't do him justice either, because when you consider the fact that he'd been playing professional basketball since he was 16 and was still able to be an effective NBA player into his late 30s after a career of devastating injuries, it really highlights how talented and skilled Sabonis really was. In the later years of his NBA career, Sabonis got to play on the game's biggest stage, and into his mid-30s he was an important piece for the Blazers teams in the early 2000s and was a part of some very competitive playoff series. Many Blazers fans to this day believe their infamous 15-point meltdown would not have happened had Sabonis not gotten into foul trouble in Game 7 for 3 quick controversial foul calls. Funnily enough, the referee from that game was Dick Bavetta, who infamously refereed Game 6 of the Western Conference Finals in 2002, a game that is considered one of the biggest robberies in NBA history, with the referees blatantly favouring the Lakers, who had more free throws in the fourth quarter than the Kings did all game. It is a common belief among a lot of NBA fans that the Lakers were seriously favoured by the NBA. Had that not been the case, then maybe Sabonis would have won his NBA championship. At the age of 38, Sabonis finally left the NBA. He returned to Europe. He ended his career in 2004 at nearly 40 years old, winning the LKL Championship as well as the EuroLeague MVP award after leading the competition in rebounds, blocks and PER. proving that even as an old man with almost 25 years in professional basketball, he could still dominate the second highest level of competition in the entire world. And yet his legacy is very complicated. In terms of his international accomplishments, Arvydas Sabonis has a very strong argument for being the greatest of all time. He won everything in EuroLeague, he won everything at international level, from the Olympics, World Cup and Eurobasket. He even medaled with 2 different countries. He was an inspiration for the next generation of European stars that went on to achieve even greater things in the NBA. But at the same time, the biggest talking point surrounding Arvydas Sabonis is what if. Over the years, as we talked about in a recent video involving Sasha Vezenkov, the EuroLeague MVP who came over to the NBA last season and failed, a big reason he may have not been successful is because of how challenging it is for older European players to come over and adapt to the American style of play after playing a different way their entire lives. Vezenkov lasted just 1 year before returning to Europe, and he was in the prime of his career. The fact that in the mid-90s, a broken down Sabonis was still able to adapt in an era of basketball that was less favourable to European players and still found ways to impact the game is not something we should take lightly, because it is very difficult. Now let's imagine that in 1986, Sabonis joined the Portland Trail Blazers after drafting him. Since he would be in America and not residing in the Soviet Union, he wouldn't have been under the same pressure to play for the national team. He wouldn't have been subjected to those brutal workouts and could have avoided those devastating injuries that changed the way he played the game. With NBA trainers and doctors, he would have had better facilities, healthcare and treatment that he wouldn't have had back home in Lithuania. So it's safe to assume that had Sabonis had the privilege of coming over at a younger age, he would have had a healthier career. If Sabonis was doing all of this in the NBA in his 30s with an injury history, how good would he have been in the prime ages of his career, between the ages of 25 and 28 years old? Ralph Sampson became a 4-time All-Star. David Robinson was an MVP. They were both at one point considered top 5 centers in an era dominated by big men. So considering the fact Sabonis held his own with those guys, it's safe to assume a prime, healthy Sabonis would have been in those conversations. But what separates the great guys, like Hakeem and Shaq from Robinson and Ewing, is that they were able to win multiple titles. One of the greatest guards from that era, Clyde Drexler, stated that if Portland had Sabonis, they could have won 4, 5, maybe 6 championships. And when you really think about it, he could be right. In the prime of Sabonis' career, he would have played for a Portland Trail Blazers team that were one of the best Western Conference teams in that time period. Between 1989 and 1992, the Blazers made the NBA Finals twice, and Conference Finals 3 times. Now if you added a prime Arvydas Sabonis to those Blazers teams, who we assume would have at worst been a top 5 center, suddenly it becomes very possible that the Trailblazers could have three-peated, because the Detroit Pistons were able to beat the Blazers because Kevin Duckworth was no match for the more physical Bill Laimbeer, who dominated Kevin Duckworth on the glass, out-rebounding him by double in that series. If you replace Duckworth, a decent NBA center, with the legendary Arvydas Sabonis at 7'3", they aren't getting out-rebounded in that series. 4 of the 5 games were decided by 6 points or less. Considering Detroit never reached the finals again after this, they were closer to their decline than people realise. And the same problems they ran into with Moses Malone, Kareem and the Celtics bigs in the 80s, they would have had that same problem against the Blazers with Sabonis. And I think it's quite likely that under these circumstances the Blazers win the championship that year. Now looking at the next year, Portland were even better. They added Danny Ainge and Terry Porter, and with a 63-19 record in the regular season, the Blazers were the 1 seed. Now depending on how good you think Sabonis was, there's all the chance with him that team wins 70 games that season, which would put Sabonis in the MVP conversation. Now despite being clear favourites to return to the finals, the Blazers lost to the Lakers in what was their final run. Magic Johnson was 31 years old and possibly playing with the disease at this point. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was gone, meaning Sabonis would have been matched up with a young Vlade Divac, who Sabonis got the better of many times in Europe, and also Vlade Divac has said Sabonis is the greatest center he ever played against. So with Sabonis, they probably win that series too and return to the NBA Finals. And as the team with championship experience against a Chicago team who hadn't yet won the finals, you could argue the Blazers would have been favored going into that series. Now, if there was one weakness in that Chicago Bulls team, it was their big men. Let's try and analyze this hypothetical. Bill Cartwright and Horace Grant would not have been able to defend Sabonis one-on-one. They would have to double him. And as possibly the greatest passing center in basketball history, Sabonis would have no trouble passing out of the double teams, which would allow the other Blazers players to go off. Regardless of how they decided to defend Sabonis, he would have put up crazy stats in this series, which would have likely resulted in a Finals MVP and possibly back-to-back NBA championships. And all of a sudden, Michael Jordan isn't flawless in the NBA Finals. The following year in 1992, the Trailblazers would be looking to three-peat. In that year, without Sabonis, they were actually the #1 seed again and returned to the NBA Finals, losing to Chicago in 6. Again, in our hypothetical, they would have been the team with championship experience. And while three-peating is incredibly difficult and has only been done a handful of times in NBA history, with Sabonis, it would have been a real possibility, and this series could have gone either way. What I would predict is that we'd have a Lakers-Celtics-like rivalry for the rest of the 90s between the Blazers and Bulls, making the Clyde Drexler-Michael Jordan debate a real thing. In this timeline, because of their success, Clyde Drexler probably doesn't join Houston in 1995. He continued to win in Houston, and assuming Michael Jordan still retires, that's an opportunity there for the Blazers to win another two. Because Chicago are out of the picture, Houston aren't as good without Drexler, and Portland as the team to beat of that era, having already won several titles in this timeline, may just win 2 more. And if we want to dig deeper into the hypothetical, if Sabonis was healthier, perhaps when the Blazers were competitive in the early 2000s, he would have been able to have a larger impact in those series that may have put them over the edge. Obviously, it would be a bit of a reach to assume they win in every one of these hypothetical scenarios, but it seems pretty fair to suggest that Sabonis was the difference between Portland being a dynasty and what they are considered today as one of the greatest teams that never won. I think in the early 90s, even the post-Achilles Sabonis, several years younger from when he did arrive in the NBA, could have still been the difference in those 3 years. And if we take away all the injuries and we get to see a prime Sabonis tap into the potential he was unable to fulfill, it's hard to see a reality where Portland don't dominate the 90s and win multiple championships in the NBA. You combine that with everything he's already accomplished internationally, then maybe all of a sudden you have a strong case for Arvydas Sabonis being the greatest player in history. And for all of those reasons, I believe Arvydas Sabonis is the biggest what if in basketball history. What if he joined the Blazers earlier? What if he never got those injuries? Would we be talking about the greatest player ever? Unfortunately, as Kanye West famously once said,
I guess we'll never know.
I want to know what you guys think. How great was Arvydas Sabonis actually, and how great do you think he could have been if he stayed healthy and came to the NBA at a younger age? And where do you rank him currently, even with his injuries, among the greatest centers of all time? Is he the greatest European player of all time? Share your thoughts and feedback down below in the comments. And if you've made it up to this point in the video and are listening, I encourage you to click that box in the middle of your screen and check out the video we referenced earlier on Sasha Vezenkov, which I think is a very curious case of a fantastic international player who was unable to succeed in the NBA. We explained exactly why in that video, so go check that out. If you've made it up to this point and enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with your friends, and on that note, it's DKM signing out until next time, and peace.